Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to let you guys know before you start up this video that the first two parts of this are pretty old. I'm going to throw a link up here as well as in the description and in the comments if you want to catch up on what's happened beforehand. However, this story does kind of stand on its own as well. So, either click one of the links, listen to the full thing, or enjoy tonight's story. Sweet dreams, kids. I apologize that it's taken me so long to update you all. I've been resting on the story for the past week, scared to share it. And I think this will be my final update. After my last post, I was contacted by my former diving supervisor. He told me the danger of sharing these stories. Then his tone changed. Things are getting worse down there. He'd never before spoken freely about it with me, but he continued. He had an incident this last week. We lost men. I was shocked. We all know the dangers. We've all seen the keepers of the deep, but nobody actually expects to die. After a close call or two, you just expect to keep having close calls. He continued, out of respect for our fallen, you need to use your best judgment before sharing this, and realize it isn't safe to share this story. The team was contacted to perform a standard salvage job for the military. They had been incredibly vague about the work, but indicated that a vessel had gone down. The dive team and their gear were loaded aboard a U.S. naval ship to be escorted to the project. This is abnormal, not unheard of. But things became more and more strange as they traveled to the project. First, they were briefed by the commanding officer. He reviewed the confidentiality agreements regarding our work. Then the brief was turned over to a man who did not introduce himself. He explained that the Navy had been working on a prototype submarine. Its capabilities and new technologies would not be relevant to us. All we needed to know is that it was tremendous. The size would dwarf any subs that we had ever witnessed. He then admitted the Navy did not need routine salvage work, but assistance recovering their prototype. He briefed the team that 4 days prior, they had lost contact with the crew. Sonar images show the submarine resting on the bottom, apparently intact, but nobody was responding to communications attempts. As the ship arrived on scene, they found that they were not alone. Nearly a dozen Navy ships were already awaiting their arrival. The divers were given the go-ahead to get in the water and begin work. Their first task was to inspect the submarine for damage and hazards. They needed to provide a bottom report for the engineers to develop a plan for raising it. They didn't want us rigging it up however seemed fit to us. They needed the prototype in as good of a condition as possible. The divers entered the water, and soon were in awe of the creation. It was like nothing they'd ever seen. It was tremendous. From where they descended, they could not see the forward or aft ends of the submarine, and the water was abnormally clear. In addition, the sub was created out of what appeared to be a reflective metal woven into scales. They began inspecting the sub for damage. After they had reached the maximum allowable bottom time, they were brought back to the surface to swap out with that event. They reported to the next set of divers that they explored from midship to the aft end and had found no apparent damage. The sub appeared to have gently set down in the sand. The next set of divers entered to inspect from midship to forward end. They began advancing while inspecting for damage, and about 10 minutes into the dive, one of the divers began tapping on the hull. Immediately, both divers reported that they could hear people inside the submarine banging against the hull and shouting out. They couldn't understand what they were screaming, but the message was clear. They were terrified. The supervisor reported that they had found evidence that the crew was still alive. The divers continued advancing. It was about 5 more minutes before their next report. There were carvings across the submarine's metallic scaled surface. Hieroglyphics had been carved into the submarine and appeared to stretch from the very front of the submarine toward midship. Still, there were no signs of structural damage. any that would have caused the submarine to cease functioning. The divers returned to the surface, and the commanding officer was given a full report on the day's findings. The team was assured that the submarine was capable of sustaining the crew. They were eager to retrieve it, but the crew was believed to be in relatively little danger. As day 2 begun, divers descended with instructions to locate 4 specific locations. Engineers needed to verify they were still structurally sound for attaching riggings. Immediately, the divers reported that they could still hear the banging coming from within. They began locating the rigging points quickly and easily. As they approached the forward end of the ship, just within the region which was now covered in carvings, they noticed a figure moving about. They both saw it. There was no denying it. But it soon disappeared from sight. The divers were unable to figure out where it had gone. They agreed to quickly find the remaining 2 points. It was quick work. The 2 remaining points were located, all 4 were intact and readily available for use. As they readied to return to the surface, they were informed that there were 2 more locations that were needed to be inspected. There were supposed to be 2 hatches, port and starboard. The engineers had insisted needed to be checked. The supervisor was wary. The engineers up here get uneasy when they heard reports of something moving around the ship. They stepped inside, and when they returned, insisted that you find the 2 hatches. I'm not sure what's going on, but they're being very ambiguous. Please be cautious. The divers returned to the area in question and began closely re-examining the area. As they worked, they soon saw a figure emerging from the submarine. It was dragging a body out of the hatch, and they froze, and watched as it pushed the hatch to close and began dragging it into the distance. Then they approached the spot and realized the hatch was almost indistinguishable between the scales and carvings in the submarine, but it was there. As they were reporting this, that hatch began to open again. Topside lost communication with the 2 divers. It was sheer panic on topside. The tenders were reporting strains on the divers' umbilicals. The standby diver donned his helmet and prepared to get into the water. The umbilicals began violently shaking and pulling, and the standby diver was clearly terrified, but nonetheless approached the side of the ship, preparing to enter the water. The strain on the umbilicals released, and suddenly the lines went limp in the water. A few moments later, air bubbles were erupting to the surface. The supervisor grabbed the standby diver and told him, "Get the divers and get the fuck out of there." He entered the water and began tracing out their umbilicals. His goal was to follow the umbilicals to the divers in distress, and as he followed the umbilicals, he saw the air violently erupting from below and continued deeper. He reached the source. The umbilicals had been cut free of the divers and were pumping air into the water. Knowing the divers had no air supply, he urgently searched the area for the 2 divers, and after 5 minutes, he had found no sign and was ordered to inspect the hatch. He frantically made his way to the hatch, hoping beyond hope to find the divers alive. And as he approached, he found the hatch open and saw the 2 bodies laying on the floor. He entered the space to retrieve them, and as he did, he noticed several figures in the darkness of the room. He grabbed the nearest body and began pulling it as the figures rushed towards him. They were instantly upon him, tearing at him and his gear. In fact, he released the body and attempted to flee the space. In the struggle, he freed himself and rocketed to the surface. He was pulled up and over the side of the ship, unconscious. His bloodied body lay on the deck, likely suffering from an arterial gas embolism from his rapid ascension. The team rushed him into the hyperbaric chamber to treat him. The supervisor informed the commanding officer that all diving had been terminated. He had lost 2 men and 1 in critical condition. There was inexplicable things happening on this submarine, and he would not sacrifice more men. The treatment continued through the night, and the diver regained consciousness. He told the supervisor he was done. He would not re-enter the water again, ever. He was assured nobody would be returning, and as soon as his treatment was complete, the entire team was returning to land. The next morning, the team was summoned for what was believed to be a debrief. They entered the room to speak with the commanding officer and his team of engineers. The CO asked them to take a seat. He then informed them that they would not move forward with the salvage of the prototype. However, what was down there couldn't remain. Whatever was inside the submarine had to be positively destroyed. The team was to re-enter the water and plant charges in locations specified by the engineering team. The supervisor was furious. He demanded that the team be taken back to the mainland and released from the ship. Armed sentries entered the room and restrained him. The CO again repeated his orders and clarified that the team would not be allowed to leave until the job was complete. Diveside was reassembled under the watch of several armed sailors. The supervisor continued to protest the job, and after over an hour of conflict, 2 divers agreed, under duress, to get in the water to plant the charges. The 2 divers entered the water. Fearfully, they moved to specified locations and began planting the charges. They began hearing the banging and shouting coming from within the sub. The divers, understanding these men would be killed, began sobbing. The CO came onto the comms and again explained that they would not be allowed to leave until the job was complete. After regaining their composure, the 2 regretfully continued. The 2 completed their task and returned to the surface. In their shame, they refused to speak to anyone and they left Diveside. The ship began departing from the location, and the team was again summoned. The commanding officer thanked them for their service to the great nation and informed them that they would be handsomely rewarded for the regrettable tragedy that they had encountered. He then went over the confidentiality of the job and everything that they had witnessed. His final words to them were, "Previous events have leaked to the public. Please realize there will be real consequences for any leaked information about what happened here today." My supervisor ended the conversation stating that the entire team had agreed they were going to leave the diving company. Their fear of the deep sea and remorse for the job were too great. He told me, "There are some places man simply isn't meant to explore."